one thing that I've always lived by is an acronym which is WWRD. And if you go ahead one more, this is ultimately what would Riker do. So I've decided to basically crowbar in an analogy from Google Analytics for machine learning modeling into Star Trek. So I'm not lying. This will get very loose and probably bore you, but then hopefully we'll come back around in the end. So what would Riker do? So if we go on one more, what's a good signal? Can I just wave? Is that right? Yeah. So Star Trek really? Yeah. So Star Trek. Yes. 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 Yeah. Yeah, that's me. Yeah. So I'm a fan. I'm a fan. This is. I thought about two things that have been quite absorbing in my life, which is two things: Star Trek and GA4, at least more recently. So back to GA4. So where do we all start? Where does it start? So if we do a bit of a jump back in time and go back to the 90s, I'm sure most of us remember the 90s. But in 1998, a company called Urchin Analytics was formed. And that's great, but we didn't really care. But that was bought by Google. If you recognize any of these logos, that will be great. And I recognize a lot of these. Google Analytics was released as we know it as Google Analytics after the acquisition from Google in 2005. And this was actually a start of a journey from Google to start to monetize their stuff, right? So in the year 2000, 2001, they released Google AdWords, and they actually started monetizing their search engine. They needed a way to measure the success of their advertising, and what better way than a common Googleism nowadays, which is to buy an existing company doing it pretty well and rebrand it as a Google product. So along comes Universal Analytics, which is the GA3, I suppose we can call it. That was back in 2012, believe it or not. And that is the current iteration of Google Analytics. There's been some quality of life improvements, but it has not really changed since 2012. And if we move on to the next one, logo, and one more, that's it. Google Analytics 4 finally came out of beta, which is a subject of conversation. It is now a stable release. As of the October 2020. So what happened then? Ultimately, a couple of months ago, in March, they announced a big deal, which was they're going to turn off Universal Analytics. By the way, I'll share the slides to this, and I've linked off all the links that I could at the bottom. They're going to turn it off, and this is the first time, 100% the first time Google's ever done something like this. Every iteration of Google Analytics beforehand has been an extension of it. It's been a slight upgrade, and you get to keep your historical data. This is a big deal, and there's a lot of people flapping about it, quite rightly so, because this is a new product. I can give you maybe over another beer afterwards. I can give you the backstory of what this is, and it is another acquisition, a company called Firebase. But they're finally turning off the old versions. And if we move on, so the March 2022, the announcement happened, and shortly after, we're going to be rushing to get to this 1st of July deadline, because once we get to July next year, Universal Analytics stops working, and finally, in January 2024, everything will be gone, subject to change, of course. But as far as we know it, this is the timeline. So we've got a 15 to 20 year time period of Google Analytics establishing itself, and then we've got 18 months of it turning itself off. So if we move on, why so fast? Why now? Why quickly get out of this space? Why do we want everyone over to GA4? And actually, that's because of one thing, which is a lot of money. There's money at stake, and let's not kid ourselves. Google are able to give away products for free because they make a shit ton of money in other places. They're an advertising company. Google Analytics is a data tool. So what's the game, right? So to talk about this, we have to introduce something which is the big four, not that big four. We talk about the next big four, which is the GAFA. I don't know if you've come across this before, but the big four. So Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, I suppose we can call it Gamma nowadays. And sometimes it's called the Big Five, if you include little Microsoft at the end, the GAMAM, which doesn't quite roll off the tongue as much. But ultimately, the Big Four, the Big Five, the GAMAS, the GAMAMs, the GAMAF, the GAFAs, whatever we want to call them, they're all fighting for your advertising budget. And I say you as a collective, as in advertisers, as people, as agencies, as whoever. These companies are fighting for your spend to tell you how well they're doing. And they've been playing this game for a long time. So that's because there was a situation where ultimately all data was shared, and third-party data ruled supreme. What that means is that whatever happened on your website, whatever happened in your apps or your platforms was shared across everyone. Facebook, Google, yourself, your CRM, every platform you owned knew that a conversion occurred, who it was from, how much it was worth, or what lead was generated at what quantity. That was great, which made some people or some companies very happy. But then, sorry, this is gonna be hard. But then what happened is that things started to change. We saw laws starting to change. And as things continued, we got to a point where cookies started to become difficult to set, and they got harder to set. We now have to ask consent. We now have to make sure that people are actively opting in. We can't just inform them prolifically. Okay, that's it. Thank you. And sorry. And we got to a point where ultimately we get to a point where we can't set cookies without informed choices from the user, which, you know, my professional life is like, oh, are you kidding me? That's crazy. That's awful. How we're meant to do our jobs. And, you know, the out of hours me is, of course, I should have choices and not be tracked by Facebook when all that crap is going on. But what this ultimately means is that things are harder. If we can't set cookies, we can't identify users, we can't track the same things we've always been tracking. What also has changed is technology changes have occurred. You've got Firefox and Safari with ITP and ETP, which is intelligent tracking prevention, and enhanced tracking prevention, that's the other one, which basically started ring fencing cookies from being set even in a first party context. So at maximum, you can set a 7-day lifetime of a cookie in some of these browsers, sometimes even 24 hours. So even when you could set a cookie from someone that has consented you to do so, it was still being stopped by these browsers. And some people that like cookies really were unhappy. And then the last thing I wanted to introduce is something called ATT, which is App Tracking Transparency from Apple last year. And if you have an Apple phone, you might have seen this pop up around March last year. And this is, believe it or not, this is giving you a choice over whether you allow your data to be shared with lots of invisible people and companies that are trying to monetize you. So I completely get it in both sides of the fence, but the opt-in rates are atrocious. Ultimately, what that means is similarly to a website, you can't set third-party cookies, you can't be tracked. You can, because Apple controls everything. But ultimately, if we move on, it made some companies very unhappy, and to a point where Meta have said that it's going to cost them $10 billion this year. That one change from Apple alone is going to cost this company $10 billion. Not a small change. So what it's basically done is cut the head off, that's the closest I could get, cut the head off of these companies. And what it means is that we're now in a world where some data is shared, only some things are available to be shared, opted in, consented, available to be shared. But first-party data reigns supreme. So that means as an organization, as an entity, you can keep your own data. Of course, you need to fulfill these orders if you're e-commerce, but you can't share that with Facebook because you want to retarget someone if they've dropped out of the basket. You know, this is not something we can do without explicit consent. And so what does that have anything to do with Google about? What we doing? Who are these shadowy people looking at us from the background? And it comes back to money. So a lot of money, this time Google's version of it. And Google earns, in a revenue perspective, $210 billion a year from just Google ads alone. That's about 90% of Alphabet's earnings, which is the roll-up company. So one platform, Google Ads, is a big chunk, right? It's a big chunk. And they don't really want to rock that boat too much, because if that happens, all of a sudden their fancy offices and daycares and all their kind of free booze and food kind of goes out the window a little bit, let alone people's job security. So they've got an incentive. And what is their answer? Their answer to $210 billion a year is GA4. GA4 is something they've introduced and they've been working on for a little while now. So there's no secret there. They've just rushed the release. And I think that's fair to say. If you are watching or listening, Google, I'm sorry, but it's true. You rushed the release, and I just wanted to read you some excerpts from their release statement. So if you go one more for me. It's privacy-centric by design, so you can rely on analytics even as industry changes like restrictions on cookies and identifiers create gaps in your data. And one more. It has machine learning at its core and gives you a complete understanding of your customers across devices and platforms. So they know that the world is changing. People's access, companies' access, their access to your data is becoming limited, and they're creating solutions, and they're solving this within GA4. So how are they going to do that? yes, it's modeling. Not this kind of modeling, of course. I did have a different slide up there, but I had to take it down because I didn't know the age ranges of people watching. What we have to put ourselves in the shoes of is Google, right? So again, why is Google doing this? Yes, they earn a shit ton of money from advertising, and this is directly affecting advertising. But if you can imagine, their perspective, their vision of the data has been skewed with this. They used to have free reign, third-party data. They saw everything. Same as Meta, you could interchange any agency or not agency, sorry, any third party with that. But from Google's perspective, they have a blurred vision of the data. So first of all, what they're introducing is conversion modeling. And I'll go into this in a bit more detail. But conversion modeling helps them reattribute conversions on your behalf, of course. And then as you layer on additional models like behavioral modeling to identify missing data within the data set, the vision becomes a bit clearer. And finally, we have a crystal clear picture of Geordie up there with data-driven attribution modeling. So the third type of machine learning modeling that is in GA4. Layer on top of that, predictive modeling. So this is where the predictive element of take all that base data that's been modeled, and then we predict that forward using another model. So I suppose we got back to layers and layers, like trying to think of a Shrek analogy of layers like onions, but I don't know why my brain went there. But we have this layer upon layer of models, data models upon data models, to try and quote unquote solve this issue, this $210 billion a year issue for them. What do we actually think? So the Google boss is pulling the strings at the top. Why are they doing this? And that's because if they have more data, that means that they can report on a higher return on investment from your advertising spend, which means you will spend more money with them, or at very least continue to spend that $210 billion a year. The last thing they need is what Meta's experienced, which is a decline in ad revenue spend. The performance of the campaigns hasn't changed, but advertisers can't measure the return anymore. That's the only difference that's occurred. They've been denied access to measure what's going on. The campaigns are probably performing as well as they've ever done. But if you can't measure it, people don't want to spend. And that is the issue. So back to the models. Let's start with the first one. I want to talk a bit about the conversion modeling. So what conversion modeling does is we have the concept, forgive me if everyone knows this or if you don't, but the marketing channel of direct is an issue in Google Analytics eyes. And what direct means is that it's the absence of a paid or organic marketing channel. So if I don't know where that click has come from, I'm going to assume it's direct. And the kind of common vernacular, the way we describe direct is navigational. I've clicked on a bookmark or typed in the URL exactly. That's not quite true, but the idea is it's an absence of anything else. It's the other bucket in Google Analytics. That sucks for Google Analytics because they're an advertiser and they want to make sure that you can do more advertising, even if, believe it or not, it's not Google. You can't invest in direct. You can invest in email, social, display, PPC, everything. You can't invest in direct. So it's an issue. So what we're going to do is we're going to take all of the stuff that we attributed to direct and we're going to reattribute it to something else, possibly a Google ad click. So one more. So I've decided to stretch the analogy continuing. This is the pros and cons list, by the way. So obviously the pro is on the left with beard and pre-beard is the con. I forgot to ask who's a Star Trek fan here, but I don't want to know anymore. So we have the pros. The pro that this can do of Google messing around and reattributing your conversions is because of that thing with ETP and ITP. You can set cookies for 7 days, 24 hours in some cases. Sometimes, someone converts beyond 7 days, and that sucks for people that have selling £10,000 cruises. How the hell are you meant to measure that? You can't. So this can help in those kind of situations. We also have the fact that they are 100% behind non-fingerprinting. I don't know where the line is. I'm not a data scientist. I'm not sure where the line is and where you can kind of draw that line between fingerprinting and not fingerprinting, but I've been assured that it's not fingerprinting based on that article that I've linked to there. So it basically uses media mix modeling techniques, MMM models, to identify trends in the data to then reattribute conversions around. It's not trying to find users again. So it's the fact that it's not tracking a user. They're not trying to recreate a user to do the attribution. They're just trying to use the kind of aggregate data to do the modeling. So there's some, silver lining there, I think. I put it on the pro side at very least. However, you can't turn this off. You cannot opt out. This is on by default. Most people I would hazard a guess, probably don't know this is happening, but it is. The other thing that sucks for people that are used to kind of fresh data in the morning in Google Analytics is this data changes for up to 7 days. The model refreshes every 7 days and the model changes potentially over that 7-day period, causing all sorts of problems, especially I pulled a number and it's different to the number you pulled, and then you pull it again the next day when the ticket gets back around to you, it'll be different again, I promise you. The other thing, which is not a surprise, but for some reason it feels surprising, is that Google are attributing their own marketing channels highly in this kind of machine learning model, right? Surprising? No. Annoying? Yes. It's good. I was actually having a discussion earlier around whether this is a pro or a con. I've put it on the con, that's where I put it. But this includes non-click, non-website activity like YouTube video ad impressions. The reason I put it as a con is because it doesn't do that for anything that's not Google, right? If you spend money through Google, it is going to try and attribute as much as it can back to Google. It doesn't matter what channel through Google. It's not going to do this through Facebook or through any other media channel. Next model. Behavioral modeling. This is something that is being rolled out right now. If you have GA4, you might not have even seen it. But this is where we have to introduce the whole concept of something called consent mode. So consent mode is another Google feature where when someone hasn't opted in to analytics storage cookies, you can still track data, right? Apparently. But this is where you can't see the user journey. We can't track some data when users don't consent to analytics cookies. So this type of machine learning modeling is to fill in those gaps. So the rule is if you don't consent, I can't track you, right? And so that creates gaps in data. So how am I going to do year-on-year comparisons, which everyone loves to see? You can't. So back to our pros and cons list. So the first pro of this kind of modeling is that it helps to maintain that year-on-year, month-on-month, pre-post cookie banner policy, right? So it helps to, maybe not to the majority of people sitting in this room, but it helps to, from an organization level, create some kind of continuity within data and trends at very least. The other thing is that it can be disabled, right? So you can opt in and out of this, and it's at the flick of a switch. You can just turn it off and on. It has no effect on historical future data. It's just an option you can toggle on and off. However, consent mode, TM, it must be used in the tracking. So if you're using Google Tag Manager, if you're using the other Google products, it's baked into these things and you need to be looking at it. There is a question mark around the validity from a GDPR perspective of consent mode. How can you track if they haven't consented? It's like, well, you can. It's called a cookieless ping. So it sounds all friendly. But there is a feature called consent mode that you need to be using because it needs to model the data on something. Thresholds apply. And so it needs a lot of data actually at the moment. They've done a lot of work on the machine learning modeling over the years, especially around data-driven attribution, which we'll talk about momentarily, around how they can kind of reduce those minimum thresholds. But right now you need 1,000 opted in and 1,000 opted out and in each users per day. Okay, the third model, close to the end, I promise. Third model is data-driven attribution. It's too long for me to type out, so it's an acronym, but you might see the DDA floating around everywhere in Google Analytics as well. So this has been around for some time, or at least in theory, or kind of previous iterations has been in Universal. They released something called an attribution project, which was like a middle step between Universal and GA4. And this is a way to algorithmically determine the value of your marketing channels that contributed to a conversion occurring. Sounds pretty great, right? So let's talk about it. So the pros, what is the good thing about data-driven attribution? It is a unique model per website, per app, per conversion. So it's not just going to create a model for you as an organization. You can apply that to every conversion. Each individual conversion event, and you can have up to 30 of these, each property in GA4 will have its own machine learning model generated off the back of this that was refreshed on a semi-regular basis. You can choose to not use it. So it's another one where you can opt out, you can choose something else, you can even see them side by side. So you can see this algorithmic data-driven approach and you can apply it against other more rules-based, easier to explain kind of attribution models. However, on the con side, again, it upweights Google advertising. They're not shy about this, but you know, who can stop them? Not only that, but it also excludes that issue of direct. So again, Google hates direct because it means you won't spend as much through their channels and other marketing channels. That's the idea, at least, or at least my theory. But direct can be a really good metric for assessing word of mouth, offline marketing, and all sorts of other kind of non-digital channels. Believe it or not, they exist. The last thing is you can't customize this. It's take it or leave it. You can't tweak it. You can't change it. You can't see how it works either. Last one, predictive modeling. This is a bit more fun, if it can be. So this is about identifying the likelihood for someone to convert or churn. And the other side of the predictive modeling is about identifying anomalies in data. So with this, let's go through some of the pros and cons. We have on the pros, we can build audiences from this. And this is really important from a suite of products because I can identify someone that's likely to convert or churn. I can sync that with Google Ads and retarget them, or find lookalikes, or do some other crazy stuff, assuming you've got consent and everything else there comes beneath that. The other side of that is I can sync that with something like Google Optimize, again, part of the Google ecosystem, and I can tailor the experience on the website, send them A/B tests, or personalize a banner message, classic red button, blue button, or give them a discount code, those kind of things, right? And the other side of this is something called alerts, or at least the spiritual successor to alerts within Universal Analytics. So these are called insights, and they can be set up even on an hourly basis on the back of these machine learning models to identify anomalies in any data point you want, and it can email you directly. Some of the cons, the conversion and churn predictions are purely e-commerce focused. If you don't sell stuff, tough. Right? There's no way around this. The only way that we've worked around it before is to recycle the e-commerce tracking for non-e-commerce websites. It just feels a bit tough. But at the moment, you can't pick and choose what they're predicting or as a conversion and churn. You just have to use e-commerce. The thresholds suck, right? You have to be big. You have to be selling. Well, there has to be around, again, I'm trying to quote from an article which I have read but not memorized. Around 1,000 converting and 1,000 non-converting and 1,000 churning users per week. So there needs to be an awful lot of stuff going on your website and app for this to work, which, in some cases you'd be like, easy. In other cases, it's like, we're never going to see this. All right, so back to Google Analytics. I just wanted to give a bit of detail on those 4 models because some of you might be aware of Google Analytics 4. Some of you never come across this. Some of you might think, I've come to a data forum and presented by a data scientist, and there's some GA4 guy coming up and talking for you to half an hour. So what I wanted to do is talk about Google Analytics 4 and some of the machine learning around it. But ultimately, the big reason is that it's free. Whether we like it or not, this is available to everyone within certain limits and thresholds for free. This is not behind a paywall. This is not a Google Analytics 360 feature. This is not something that a certain class of website or affordability can buy you. This is now part of the base level of Google Analytics. Another point of Google Analytics is there's no collection limits either. So you can be Facebook and collecting all data into GA4 using these machine learning models. Cool, right? Is it? I don't know. Because it's a black box, right? That's the other thing, is we're trusting a black box model to do this. And we don't have any way of seeing the code. We don't know, not that I would know what it would say, but I have no way of seeing the code. What is it? We don't know. We're trusting in the entity, a small company called Google, to do all this for us and assume they have our best interests at heart. Probably a reaction right now, maybe not externally, I can see, but maybe internally of like, cool, that's great, thanks for telling me, but what was the point? And actually, there's one way that we can approach this, and that is that also part of the free version of Google Analytics 4 is that we can now export all of the data to BigQuery and do our own modeling. And that includes the unconsented data, by the way, so again, gray area. But all of the consented and unconsented data is synced at an event level from your websites and apps. There's 2 types of exports. You can do daily export tables, and you can do real-time streaming of that data as well. So you can do some pretty cool stuff all for free. Well, you pay for the storage and the processing in BigQuery, but pennies, let's be honest. So then you might be thinking, that's cool, but you're probably not a doctor, but I am not a data scientist. That's great that we can do that, but let's be honest, 99% of people aren't. Let's be honest, let's pick a number, 80% of the people using Google Analytics are marketers, and it's not their full-time job to use Google Analytics. So they're going to be using a product where machine learning is there, predictive modeling is here. I can predict the future. This is great. This is amazing, and not really thinking too much about it. So ultimately, can we trust it? This is something that everyone is going to have access to. We aren't sure as data professionals whether this is a good or a bad thing, but nevertheless, come July next year, everyone, absolutely everyone with a Google Analytics account will be using this. I don't know. Sorry, I don't know. I don't know if it's a good thing. But the way I see it is, I get this a lot actually at work. What's your point? Like you talk to me for, I don't know how long I've been going for, probably an hour or so, or at least it feels like it. What's your point? What are you talking about? What's the purpose of this conversation? And the way I see it is that we have 3 options. Pick your best Spock. So 3 options. The first one, the Nimoy way, is to understand and accept exactly what's going on, or just be comfortable with it enough so that you can use it, understand the caveats, and move forward with your life. Google Analytics is not, everyone's day to day. It happens to be my world, but it doesn't have to be yours. We understand the flaws, the warts and all. We'll just get on with our lives. Thank you very much. The Quinto way is to just accept that we just have incomplete data now. Maybe we take the feed to BigQuery and do our own modeling. So we take the real stuff in Google Analytics and we go do our own clever stuff outside of it. And we trust our own people and our own models to do this. Completely valid way. And we can do, again, do all this for free. And lastly, the Peck way. Ethan Peck, by the way, probably new to a lot of you. Good Spock. Is to reject everything, throw it all out, don't care for GA, what have you done? My lovely GA. Let's be honest, Google Analytics is going from a data tool to a marketing tool. It's always been a marketing tool, but it's no longer for analysts, it's for marketers. And so sod it, let's go do our own thing. Let's pick another product. Let's build our own pipeline. Let's do something else. You don't have to use Google Analytics. I know it's hard to say out loud. You don't have to use Google Analytics. So whatever your favorite is, whichever way you decide to go, just remember that Google Analytics is not agnostic. It does not have your interests at heart. It has a $210 billion a year minimum. That's just Google Ads, just to reiterate, stake of this game. Because Google Analytics is owned by Google. Sometimes we just call it GA for short, and we lose the kind of context of what we're saying. It's Google. It's a Google product. They're an advertising company. You might recognize some of them, you might not, but that's hundreds of billions of dollars a year in logos right there, and it means an awful lot. So bringing it back to the start, hopefully, what would Riker do? There he is, lovely man. I couldn't find a beaming transition, so he floated in from the top. What would he do? He's my favorite character. Bit of background on Riker, by the way. He's first officer. He's not the captain. He's not he is number 1. They call him number 1, but he's the first officer. He's not in control of a ship. He's not the pilot. He doesn't fire the weapons. He's not a doctor, right? He's the first officer, and he is the most important person on the ship. And I think that what would Riker do? He's one of us. Riker is one of us. He is the guy that has all of the information to hand. We might not be making the decisions about what we do with the data or how we act on it, or even what the product is we use. We might be thrusted Google Analytics 4 upon us and we have no choice. But he makes the best of a situation, good or bad, and he informs the people around him to make the best decisions based on the awareness that he has. Without him, the ship would fall apart, but he doesn't have a tangible job to play on the bridge. Yet he happens to sit there right next to the captain. So what would Riker do? Be the best informed he could be and make other people make the best decisions they can do. Thank you.